recent revelations around the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. It is possible to ask blue card questions and request catch the eye speaking time either through the traditional method or electronically. As is the case, we won't allow blue cards in the first round when political group spokesmen have the floor, but you will be able to ask blue card questions when backbenchers speak in the second round. So without further ado, let's begin the debate. And our first speaker is Commissioner Jourova. Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you for coming. You have the floor, Madam.
Mr. President, honourable members, I would first like to thank you for putting the situation of the rule of law in Malta on today's agenda. It is essential that all EU institutions contribute within their respective roles to upholding the rule of law in the EU. In this regard, the recent visit of the European Parliament's delegation in Malta and today's debate are of great importance. As President von der Leyen made clear, she is concerned by recent developments in Malta. The Commission has been following the developments in Malta very closely. The Commission condemns the assassination of journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. Her murder was an attack on the free media and is a grave concern to Europe as a whole. Media freedom is the foundation of our free and democratic society. Journalists must feel safe to work in Europe. If not, democracy as we know it will be under threat. It is not the Commission's role to comment on ongoing national investigations, but we have said it very clearly many times that we expect a thorough and independent investigation free from any political interference. I repeated this message directly to the Maltese ministers I spoke to recently. Europol is in Malta and has supported the investigations in Malta as a top priority case with experts on the spot and from Europol headquarters. The support activities are ongoing and will continue. It is crucial that all those responsible are brought to justice as soon as possible. The people of Malta, and first and foremost the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, demand truth and justice, and we stand with them. I also made this very clear during my visit to Malta in June 2018. Our role, the role of the Commission, is to address more structural and systemic issues, in particular in the area of judiciary and the fight against corruption and money laundering, and we have done just that. The Commission has already been clear on the issue. There are a number of structural reforms that Malta is undertaking or needs to undertake. This was clearly stated in the European Semester country-specific recommendations, which were adopted by the Council on 9 July 2019. The Commission also brought infringement procedures regarding the incomplete transposition of the Anti-Money Laundering Directive and adopted an opinion on measures to be taken by the Anti-Money Laundering Supervisor following the adoption of a finding of breach of Union law by the European Banking Authority. And we are not the only ones on whose advice Malta can rely. In its opinion of December 2018, the Venice Commission and in its evaluation report on Malta in April 2019, the Group of States Against Corruption of the Council of Europe also raised a number of concerns in line with those of the Commission. The Commission is in regular contact with the Maltese authorities and will continue working with the authorities to accelerate these reforms. I will in particular highlight the following priorities for urgent action. One of the top priorities for Malta is to strengthen the independence of the judiciary, in particular the safeguards for judicial appointments and dismissals, and to establish a separate and fully independent prosecution service. There is also a need to strengthen efforts to detect and prosecute corruption and the enforcement of the anti-money laundering framework. I am aware that the Maltese authorities have at several occasions expressed their intention to proceed with the necessary reforms in the areas of concern I have mentioned. But there is still a lack of significant progress. The latest developments show that no further time should be lost. The Commission has underlined that any reform must comply with EU law and European standards relating to the rule of law. We have strongly encouraged Malta to properly consult the Venice Commission. As regards the prosecution services, Malta adopted the State Advocate Act in July 2019 and appointed its first state advocate. However, concerns remain as regards, among others, the lack of checks and balances in the appointment procedure of the Attorney General, which in practice is still under the power of the Prime Minister. The Commission expects the Maltese authorities to implement in full the recommendations of the Venice Commission and to follow up on the findings and recommendations of the European Commission. We are in contact with the authorities. Commissioner Reynders and I both talked with Justice Minister Bonnici last week, and we will continue to insist on the need to accelerate the reforms. Just yesterday, Commissioner Reynders sent a letter to the Maltese authorities outlining the concerns and need for speedier reforming. Let me emphasise that the rule of law issues are European issues. The EU is built on mutual trust among its members, and each European citizen deserves justice. This is why we will continue to closely follow the situation. We stand ready to work with the Maltese authorities on all these aspects and to provide support where necessary. More generally, we will soon put in place a new rule of law mechanism covering all member states, including Malta, to improve prevention, dialogue and monitoring. This will cover judicial independence as well as anti-corruption and aspects of media pluralism relevant to the rule of law. Honourable members, I can assure you that the Commission will not hesitate to take measures as necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Commissioner. After having heard from the Commission, we will now move on to group spokesmen, and we begin with Mr. González Pons. Go ahead, sir.
Daphne Caruana believed that there was no place for injustice, abuse of power and impunity in Malta. She believed that no one was above the law, not an ordinary citizen, not the wealthiest and the powerful, not even the Prime Minister. She fought until the end for what she believed was right. Those who planned her assassination may have silenced her voice, but they inspired thousands of people to speak out, and thousands can be silenced. Something is wrong when those who promise to serve the people use the institutions against the people. Something is wrong when a democratic government is under suspicion of covering up the assassination of a journalist. Something is wrong when the freedom of expression is not freedom anymore, but a deadly risk. The Union cannot afford a country in economic ruin. How can we afford a government in moral ruin? From here, I call on you directly, Prime Minister Muscat. The eyes of all journalists across Europe are on you. I call on you directly. Every day that you remain in office is a shame for democracy and an offence to the memory of Daphne Caruana. I call on you directly. Every day you are in power is a slap in the face of thousands of Maltese people asking for justice and truth. Prime Minister Muscat, if your office, the office of the Prime Minister, has been involved in a murder, what else we still don't know? You must step down. Prime Minister Muscat, this is not about you anymore. It's about Malta. In this dark moment of the history of Malta, the European Parliament and the EPP stand together with the Maltese people. You are not alone. Truth will be revealed. Justice will be done.
Thank you. Next speaker is Birgit Sippel. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. In Malta geht es immer noch die
In Malta, they're still carrying out investigations into Daphne Caruana Galizia's death, who was murdered because of her own investigations. Her death is something which shocked us all, and we have to ensure that those behind it and the perpetrators are brought to justice swiftly. Here we're talking about corruption and therefore the rule of law more generally. And the opinion from the Venice Commission very clearly stated that the laws, constitution and proceedings for nominating people to public positions need to be reviewed in order to ensure justice and the rule of law in the country. This is a difficult job in a country where they've got around 500,000 citizens, and there is corruption that's very widespread. Over the past few years, a lot of distrust has built up amongst the general population, and we have to ensure that we get the right balance between information going to the public on the one hand and privacy and confidentiality of the investigations on the other. We've seen the first consequences already. We've seen people charged and taken into custody. The support of the Maltese authorities provided by Europol is something which will be very helpful. And in the reform of the justice system, we've also seen a few positive developments there with the involvement of government, opposition and civil society. This needs to be guided not only by the Venice Commission but also by our European Commission as well. So what do we do from here? Well, the investigations into the death and particularly corruption and selling citizenships is something which is still going on, and we need to ensure these investigations continue. At the moment, Malta is a symbol for corruption for a great many people, and it should be our common responsibility to change that. We should not have this kind of thing happening in the centre of Europe. We need to ensure that there is change, of course, sticking to all of the rules, ensuring that there are no infringements. The investigations and procedures in Malta need to continue, but we also need to use these measures to prevent this kind of thing happening in other member states in the future. And we also need to have a decision for the EU rule of law mechanism across Europe, and we need to ensure that people can have faith in democracy, rule of law and fundamental rights once again. This is something which needs to be our common goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Sophia in 't Veld. 3 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madam Commissioner. We are here today not just to condemn a murder, but we are here to discuss the response of the EU institutions. And in that context, I note that once again the Council is absent, and that is significant. They're not taking responsibility for any of this. We visited Malta 2 weeks ago, and what we saw has not reassured us. It has basically fanned our concerns, and I'm also deeply concerned at the lack of urgency that I sense in particular in the Council and to a lesser degree in the Commission. I welcome that this Commission is at least taking steps in contrast to the previous Commission that was completely silent. But we have to realise that we are dealing here with hard-nosed criminals who are literally ready to kill. They're not going to be terribly impressed by a bureaucratic response or by the Venice Commission or by infringement procedures. They're criminals, that's what we're dealing with. And what is more worrying are the connections between those criminals and politics all the way up to the office of the Prime Minister. That is what we're talking about. And this is part of the fabric that is the European Union. Now the question is, at the end of this, will we be able to look ourselves in the eye? Will we be able to look into the eyes of the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia and say that we have done everything in our power? Everything. And yes, within the limits, Mrs. Sippel, of the rule of law. But the presumption of innocence should never become the pretense of innocence. Now, there is, first of all, the immediate term, and that is to safeguard the integrity of the murder investigation. And I note here that although it is not our task to call for the resignation of the Prime Minister, that is the duty of the Maltese Parliament and it should not be absolved of its responsibility. I do think that we should point out here that his continued presence in the office of the Prime Minister is cause for grave concern, because if there is a risk, real or perceived, of meddling with the investigation, and basically we are eroding the trust in the investigation, trust in the authorities and in the rule of law. And therefore I would like to really urge the European Commission to immediately start the dialogue in the rule of law framework. And I'm glad that the Commission has already sent a letter yesterday. And of course the Council should be deeply ashamed of itself. The government leaders who are sitting at the table with the Prime Minister of Malta refusing to even discuss what is going on. It is deeply shameful. They should take responsibility for the integrity of the European Union. Of course, in the longer term, there is the rule of law reforms, the constitutional reforms, banning corruption, money laundering, ending the sale of passports, and all the rest of it. But in conclusion, colleagues, we have to recognise this is not a technocratic issue. It's not just a legal issue. This is an issue of taking political responsibility for the health of the democratic rule of law in the European Union as a whole. Because if we don't do it, and if we don't do it now, this disease will spread. So let's act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Sven Giegold. 3 minutes, please.
President, ladies and gentlemen, there was a group of members from this Parliament who went to Malta a couple of weeks ago. What we saw there is clearly advances being made in the investigations into the murder case, but an alarming stagnation of investigation into corruption and money laundering that goes all the way to the top of political society. And here in the European Union, we cannot have a culture of stagnation in pursuing accusations of money laundering and corruption. The weakest link in the European Union is always our problem, and that's why it's of central importance that the European Commission now puts everything in train to make sure that the rule of law can be applied so we can see things change in Malta. Ladies and gentlemen, there's one note of warning I'd like to sound. We shouldn't be caught out by any advances made in pursuing the murder investigations into Daphne Caruana Galizia. We're seeing a high level of corruption being having accusations levelled at the highest level of governance when it comes to the investigations. So we need to see reflection of that in the investigations. The Commission has to make sure that serious work is continued. The European Union is a community of law, and in changing the situation in member states, they have to keep to the law, obviously, but there's a great deal more that we can do than the previous Commission did. The previous Commission, basically, despite 2 very important resolutions from the European Parliament, just sat by idly and did very little. What is preventing you from making sure that any state that sells passports to start an infringement proceeding pursuant to Article 4.3 of the treaty because of disloyal actions? Why can you not make sure that public procurement corruption is not pursued through infringement proceedings? What is stopping you when it comes to corruption of making sure that the area of planning rights, which is actually destroying the environment, by the way, that corruption charges are brought there? What is stopping you when it comes to anti-money laundering policy, that you don't just look at individual specific questions and opening infringement proceedings, but also the systematic non-application of law? So there's a long list of infringement proceedings when it comes to the separation of powers as well, where the current Maltese government is not implementing the Venice Commission's proposals properly. Start infringement proceedings. Make sure that the first steps are taken within the framework of the rule of law be started, so that systematically the issues of the rule of law are addressed in Malta. The European Commission is also responsible to make sure that we all contribute to improving the situation both in Malta and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Marco Dreosto. He has 3 minutes as well. Thank you, President. My first thought goes to Daphne Caruana Galizia and her family. As the Commissioner rightly said, no journalist should die for doing their job. Daphne Caruana was investigating corruption in Malta, a country which has seen a worrying increase in crime in the recent years. She was reporting on the scandal of Schengen visas which are being sold, sometimes to possible jihadists, to Libyans, the 650,000 euro scandal as well, the idea that money was being laundered, which is quite clearly from illegal sources on the island. And also there's Malta's amnesia when it comes to immigration. In these cases, all of the criticism was levelled at Italy and Minister Salvini. But how often did Malta not help save migrants who were then brought to Italy by NGOs? As a big supporter of the Maltese Prime Minister, there were quite a lot of governments in Europe, including a certain Matteo Renzi, an Italian Prime Minister. He tweeted, "The man who solved the migrant problem is not Conte or Salvini, it's Joseph Muscat, the Prime Minister of Malta." And Salvini attacked him for obvious reasons, that he's not a leader like him. Perhaps Mr. Renzi would have done better to think before he tweeted, in light of the very serious events that have occurred on Malta subsequently. But let me also remind how another man of the Italian left, Sandro Gozzi, who was a candidate in the recent European elections and will soon join the Renew group. He was an advisor to the Maltese government, though he resigned in October. This is another example of the hypocrisy in this House, where people always try to criticise Matteo Salvini and Italy, and our Hungarian friends who want to stop illegal immigration, who want to defend the Christian roots of Europe, who want to stand up against a union of banks and in favour of democracy. Perhaps before criticising someone else, some of these groups would have done better to check what was going on in their own political family, so they would have avoided looking very bad. Colleagues, let me end by saying I hope that everybody will soon start being more calm, more consistent, and in particular that we finally see more justice. Let's hope that we all have a happy and healthy Christmas. Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Asita Kanko for 1.5 minutes, please.
A free press keeps us free. It shines a light on the darkest and most corrupt corners of our societies. It holds politicians, governments, but also businesses accountable. It keeps the eyes of our citizens wide open. From where I come from, I had never imagined that modern-day Europe, the continent of enlightenment, would become the home to corruption, to press intimidation, and to the assassination of journalists. That serious concern about a criminal investigation, the independence of a criminal investigation, or serious concerns about the independence of government action would weave itself around the roots of our democracies. If Europe is to speak with authority and credibility on governance, on freedom, and on the fundamental rights, then Europe must become the best it can be. If we are to win back the trust and retain this trust from our citizens, then we need to keep ourselves to the highest standards. Daphne Caruana Galizia was a mother and a wife who will not be going home on Christmas Eve to hug her sons or smile to her husband because she did her job as a journalist. And this family of hers cannot mourn because there is no justice yet. Not only must be justice for Daphne and her family, but also justice for our press, for the sake of our democracy. We need to look into the mirror and dare face what we might become if we do not make that justice happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Stelios Kouloglou. 2 minutes, please.
All right. A terrible crime has been committed in Malta, and the responsible for the crime must be brought to justice, and the political responsible must also resign. So, Mr. Muscat, with his chief of staff being involved, allegedly involved in the crime, must go right now, because we are afraid he's going to put obstacles in the investigation up to the moment when he wants to leave in January. All right. And for once, we agree with EPP that Mr. Muscat must go. But I hope, dear colleagues, that you will display the same straight courage and the same, you will be as adamant as that when we will speak about Mr. Orban and the violations of rule of law, not only about Malta anyway. Because, you know, Malta, a crime has been committed, but it's not the only place that crimes are committed. It's not the only place that there is corruption. It's not the only place there are fiscal paradise. No, let me finish. Let me finish, please. Let me finish. I hope I'm repeating. I hope you will display the same straight and adamant character when we will talk about violations of the rule of law in Hungary and other countries where governments of yours are in place, right? Okay. So there is a problem in different countries. No, it's not Malta the only fiscal paradise in the European Union. There are a lot of them. It's not the only country that is giving golden visas and golden passports. No, there are other countries. There are other countries that at the same time they are denying to the refugees and immigrants to give them visa, while the rich people from everywhere can have a visa and a passport. That's the same. That's the same. That's against the values of the European Union. Now, we have, because I has been interrupted, just a second. Malta is the symptom, is not the cause. Something is rotten in the kingdom of the European Union, and we have to correct it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. As I said at the beginning, you can't have blue cards in the political group spokesman round, only when backbenchers take the floor. And our next speaker is John Tennant. 1.5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. In Malta, you may well be right to say that the independence of the judiciary needs to be protected. You may well be right that the outgoing Prime Minister should, in fact, be outgoing right now rather than next year. Our hearts should, must and do go out to the family of Daphne Galizia, and Maltese internal democratic processes need to stop government by cover-up. But be careful. History teaches us that whenever the European Union sits in judgment over its member states, it almost invariably makes things worse. Just in the last few years, the EU has messed up its response to Catalonia, Poland, Hungary, and of course my own country, the United Kingdom. Funny, isn't it? When a member state shows self-determination, whether rightly or wrongly, the EU applies pressure and interference. When an EU 27 interferes in an EU 1, it rarely ends well. Merry Christmas.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Roberta Metsola. For 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. We should not have to be debating this today. Malta should not have to spend the run-up to Christmas on the streets, and Daphne Caruana Galizia should still be writing. But we have been forced to stand up to face down a criminal network that has seized control and chipped away at the pillars of our republic, protected by a Prime Minister who refuses to resign immediately. And this is not hyperbole. For years, our Prime Minister and his paid envoys have conducted a taxpayer-funded disinformation campaign of vitriol targeting anyone and everyone who dared stand up to them. They tried to intimidate, threaten and silence by calling rallies to denounce us as traitors. But we knew then what the world knows now, and we refused to give in. Now we want the world to know that we are not all cut from the same cloth as Joseph Muscat and the criminals that he empowers. Because when the world looks at Malta, they should see our face, a people standing up. They should see people like Michael and Rose, Peter and Matthew, Andrew and Paul, Daphne's family, whose search for justice sparked a light that even the darkest of forces could not extinguish. We are closer to justice than ever before, but we are not there yet. Muscat is still trying to cling to power for at least another 30 days of chaos, interfering, influencing and contaminating the investigation. He must resign immediately if my country stands any chance of moving forward. This must be a catalyst for change. We need a new rule of law mechanism that looks at the situation in every member state, and we needed it yesterday. People fighting corruption, abuse of power and criminality should never be faced with shrugs of shoulders, inaction or excuses that protect political allies. We need the whole truth, we demand justice, we must have accountability. And then we need a massive programme of reforms, because after Joseph Muscat, nothing can ever be the same again.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Miriam Dalli. 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair.
The assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia was an act of terror that rocked my country. And as I have insisted before, I will insist again today. Justice must be done and seen to be done. Since day one, the Maltese authorities sought the assistance of international specialists, including the FBI and Europol, and tangible results were achieved. Action has to be taken against whoever is responsible, whoever those persons may be. And Malta is currently experiencing unprecedented circumstances that shook the whole society, and we want these realities to be addressed in a constructive manner. Several recommendations have been made. Some of the judicial changes proposed have already been carried out. Others, including recommendations by the Venice Commission and country-specific recommendations, are in the process of being carried out, and they will continue to be carried out. As the Maltese SD delegation, we are committed to ensure that the reforms our country has started to implement will continue at a speedier pace, so that there are no doubts cast on the impartiality of our institutions. We want to make sure that checks and balances will be ingrained at all levels. We are confident that the process under the oversight of the President of Malta to propose constitutional reforms will yield results. In the meantime, all alleged cases of corruption must be thoroughly investigated. No one is above the law, and the fact that time barring on cases of political corruption was removed should ensure a judicial process in all cases, whenever they happened. Currently, there are 5 ongoing magisterial inquiries on cases of alleged corruption. And yes, we want these inquiries to be concluded as soon as possible for the benefit of all. Malta is currently going through a period of political transition until a new Prime Minister is appointed. And it would be counterproductive if this Parliament rushes into prejudgments that can also prejudice the ongoing investigations. I'm here to speak up for a country that showed that it listens, a country that is open to the recommendations made, a country that implements, and yes, to respond to those who find it convenient to harm Malta and its people at this hour. And one final comment to the European Commission. Madam Jourova, you referred to this. But I urge you to propose as quickly as possible a rule of law mechanism made up of independent experts that monitors all the member states in an objective and fair manner. It is what we really need, because conclusions that are not objective do not help anyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Miriam Daly, you've got a blue card from Mr. Xavier Zarzalejos. I would like to know if you're wanting to answer that.
Who, please?
Mr. Xavier Zarzalejos.
Sure.
Yes?
Chair, I'm afraid that the situation is not as described by my colleague of S&D, because reports continue coming that supporters of the Socialist Party in Malta are intimidating and deriding civil society activists and family members of Daphne Caruana Galizia. One socialist minister has actually said that activists are acting in a provoking manner. Is this an acceptable statement to you from a minister within your political family?
Answer that for 30 seconds.
Sure. I have always been in favour of protests that are peaceful and non-violent. I think this is something that this House agrees to, and a lot of protests have been going on, and I do not find myself comfortable condemning any protests that are peaceful whatsoever. There were also sit-ins in the office of the Prime Minister. I think that goes to show that protests are being carried out, and that they are being carried out with all due respect to the process.
Muito obrigado.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Michal Chimeczka for 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll speak in Slovak language because the situation indirectly concerns my country, Slovakia, as well. Delegácia
The EP delegation brought back from Malta with a horrible report on the state of rule of law and connections among oligarchs, judiciary and the highest political offices. And that is a system of corruption that made it possible that Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed, and for years the investigation has been hindered. In a similar way, in Slovakia, this corruption system made it possible that Jan Kuciak and his fiancée was killed. It's incomprehensible that despite all the information we know about the situation in Malta, the European Council is too slow to move, can't get to lead a political discussion with the Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, not to mention to take a principled stance. Governments and leaders of the Member State must realize that the European Union can't survive unless they themselves take the values seriously. Without mutual trust in states' compliance with the principles of democracy, rule of law and human rights, there will be no single market, cohesion policy or cooperation. Values is not a luxury good. It's the basis for a well-functioning of the European Union, and therefore it's high time for the monitoring of democracy to become an integral part of the European project. And there must be a cooperation with all institutions, not only the Commission and the Parliament, but also Member States. Together we must set criteria to be applied equally to everyone, not a replacement of Article 7, but as a complement to it, so that it will no more be possible that in any Member State a corruption system exists that makes it possible to murder a journalist.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Gwendolyn Delbo Caulfield. For 2.5 minutes, please.
Il y a 2 ans, une femme
2 years ago, a brave woman, Daphne Caruana Galizia, an investigative journalist, was murdered for trying to reveal corruption at the heart of Malta. She didn't represent any political party. She wasn't partisan to any cause. She had no personal interest. She was just trying to reveal the extent of the corruption in the country. Today, what she discovered and these links between politicians, government and corruption have seen the light of day. This is something which is of concern to the Commission, the Council and the Parliament. It is of concern to the fundamental rights in the EU. It reminds us of the cases of Hungary and Poland, and it calls into question the rule of law in the country. It also reminds us that the explosive situation in Malta was able to get worse because of gaps in EU law relating to tax havens. We should not have tax havens in the EU. It should not be possible for us to sell citizenship in the EU. We have to say clearly that not only is it immoral, it is illegal, and it should be illegal. We all need to try to decouple national citizenship and European citizenship within these specific passport buying cases. Here, welcoming oligarchs and money laundering is something which has polluted the institutions at their very basis. And this has major repercussions for a government of any colour. We shouldn't be handing out gold stars and black marks to one political party or another. We should be speaking out against selling passports and this kind of activity. The European Commission is speaking about creating a rule of law mechanism with an annual report on the rule of law in each member state. And this is absolutely vital because the rule of law finally will become a priority for the European Union. Today in Council and in Commission, it has been budgetary issues and economic matters for the past decades that have been the major concern for member states. Rule of law needs to become just as important as structural adjustments in member states. It is the Council and the Commission now that need to show the same bravery and the same courage of their commitments as investigative journalists have throughout Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jérôme Rivière, who has 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Well, we're all shocked by the murder of Daphne Caruana on the 16th of October 2017 in a car bomb. She had written very good articles condemning endemic corruption in her country, and now we're seeing accusations levelled at the Prime Minister Joseph Muscat and the corrupt people around him, because they are corrupt. We heard the Prime Minister say on Sunday that he's going to resign, but it will only be effective as of January. He agreed, in fact, that he had interfered in the investigations, but we don't hear the socialists in this chamber condemning this attack on human rights. For the French socialists, who are always pointing the finger, we hear radio silence. We see that the Labour Party in Malta is extremely corrupt, and yet they are the ones who are selling passports and visas to dubious billionaires who may be terrorists. But it's not Article 7, illegitimate mechanism that it is that's being applied. It's people on the streets who should be choosing their destiny. There shouldn't have to be a serious and deep crisis for the people to rise up, as was the case in the UK last week. We should see everybody in the government resign, and there should be free elections without being overseen by the European Union.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Doris Nikolsonova for 1 minute, please.
When we talk about Malta, we also have to talk about Slovakia. What is the price of a murder of a journalist? In Malta, 150,000. In Slovakia, 70,000 euros. The murders of Daphne Galizia and Jan Kuciak only revealed what you turn a blind eye on. Rule of law in these EU member states was dismantled to pieces by mafia governments. Brussels keeps sending delegations, adopts resolutions. The corrupted politicians in these countries keep disinformation campaigns that they blame George Soros or NGOs and try to induce a feeling that the truth has no longer any value. In Slovakia, the socialists together with fascists adopted a 50-day poll moratorium, and the chairman of the European Committee openly defends communism. Malta and Slovakia have one thing in common. They have the socialist governments, and Brussels has to stop protecting the mafia governments in its own member states. This is what we owe to the citizens of the EU that corrupted politicians have stolen their states from.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Marisa Matias, who has 1.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Some members of this House had the chance of knowing Daphne Caruana Galizia when she was still with us, when we were working on a committee of inquiry dealing with the accounts and the mysterious goings-on of the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister. She was somebody who carried out these investigations, and when she was murdered, part of the rule of law in Malta died with her. What we have in Malta is open door to corruption in terms of gold visas and money laundering. The fact that we don't have the possibility to protect investigative journalists is a guarantee that democracy is not working. There are large numbers of journalists who are trying to defend democracy. We should have governments defending these journalists. The presence of members of the government up to 2 months ago has made certain that it's impossible to have an impartial investigation into the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. That's why we shouldn't wait for Mr. Muscat to resign. It's not interference, it's simple respect for the rule of law. It's not a question of who's worse. Is it Malta? Is it Poland, Slovakia or Hungary? The rule of law is being buried in the European Union. This is what we should be worried about, and we should get together and defend democracy together. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ignazio Corrao, who has 1.5 minutes.
Grazie Presidente. Bene.
Thank you. 2 years ago, immediately after the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, we had a debate here in the European Parliament. I remember that Mr. Tajani, on behalf of Parliament, and Mr. Timmermans, on behalf of the Commission, tried to be as clear as possible about what had happened. I, at the time, spoke about the mafia methods that had been used to murder Daphne Caruana Galizia. It was very clear that nobody else should stick their nose into this matter. Now look at where we find ourselves. We've got business owners who have been arrested and other people being investigated. We don't exactly know what happened between Mitzi, Muscat, the various different people involved in this actually did. It's clear, however, what the cause of all of this was. This is something that Daphne Caruana Galizia herself spoke about. She spoke about money laundering and about corruption. She spoke about interests and financing from the European Commission for energy projects which are still being funded by the European Commission. The list of projects that are involved, the CEF, for example, these are all things that we need to be very clear about. I think at the moment it seems that we've not got enough clarity, and we absolutely need to insist that the rule of law returns to Malta and to the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corrao. Our next speaker is Antonio Tajani, who has 1.5 minutes. Joseph Muscat and his government should resign as soon as the vote in this House takes place. The vote on our resolution will be a kind of European vote of no confidence in the way Muscat and his government has performed. He should also resign to allow the police and the legal service to do their job, because until we have uncovered who is behind the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, we need to know who was in charge, and Muscat is not allowing that to happen. We also need to restore dignity to a country which shouldn't be regarded as where such passports are sold to Russian magnates, where dirty money is recycled. Malta's not that. Malta is a country that needs its dignity back, and it can be done if the Prime Minister resigns. And his resignation should also withdraw the veil of complicity in more or less legal dealings with other member states of the European Union, governments and party comrades, former prime ministers. The European Union needs to do more than it's done up to now. In this House, I remember people defending Muscat. We had an exchange of views with the Commission on this, and the Commission sent a letter asking for the rule of law to be re-established fully in Malta and that Malta act properly. That's good. We want to see clarity. We want all countries to be treated equally, because if a journalist is murdered, it's not just a violation of the rule of law, it's something more serious. The murderers are hiding with the complicity of the government. That's why, Mr. President, we need to show light on this. We need to give Malta back its dignity and allow justice to be done, and make sure that the sacrifice of Daphne Caruana Galizia is not in vain. Thank you very much. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Juan Fernando López Aguilar, who has 2.5 minutes.
Señor Presidente.
Thank you, President. Vice President Jourova, Commissioner Reinders, 2 years ago the whole of the European Union was shocked and moved at this brutal mafia-type murder of a investigative journalist in Malta, Daphne Caruana Galizia. We paid tribute to her memory on more than one occasion in this House, but the story isn't over yet. The committee that I have the honour of chairing listened to Andrew, Paul and Matthew, her sons, and we committed ourselves to them. We promised that justice would be done. We've got to see that justice is done. That means trusting that the police investigation, which have involved the FBI, Europol and Interpol, are completely allowed to go through and show who is responsible, come what may. And they need to be able to do their job. And further, we need to stress the European message in Malta, in the whole of the EU, in the battle against corruption, to put an end to the sale of these golden visas, golden passports, which allow mafiosi to circulate freely through the European Union. We need to stop the money laundering from illicit sources and the sordid links between money and politics. One of the smallest countries of the European Union, one of the smallest populations of the whole of the European Union. But in particular, we need to make certain that finally we can have some kind of mechanism of the rule of law, fundamental rights and democracy, which we've called for time and again in the Libe Committee. We support the missions that the committee has carried out to Malta, the last one only a week or so ago, and we totally endorse its conclusions. But we need to make sure that all member states submit on a regular basis in a same calm way, without any criticisms of political bias, that they will abide by the questions of legal independence and the rule of law, which underpin principles which underpin the European Union. And we need to make sure that access to funds and the EU budget is conditional to meeting the rules of the rule of law. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Muito obrigado, Sr. Lopez.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lopez Aguilar. There's a request for a blue card, sir, from Mr. Weber. Would you like to take the question? Mr. Weber, go ahead, 30 seconds, sir.
President, honourable member, I think we in this chamber all share this idea that we have to have faith in the authorities to investigate. We've heard this from the Social Democrats as well, and that we can't have preconceived ideas here. But the political appraisal has already been undertaken. The Prime Minister has voluntarily offered his resignation, so the political appraisal has been carried out, and that's why I cannot understand why the Social Democratic group still is sticking to Mr. Muscat. I think Mr. Muscat has to leave the path free now to allow independent investigation to be carried out. So the only demand in the room is that he not remain in office for 30 days further, that he immediately resigns. Hence the question to the Social Democrats: why are you not prepared to support that demand?
Muito obrigado, Sr.
Thank you. Mr. Lopez Aguilar, to answer. Mr. Weber, all member states of the EU have their own mechanism for the allotment of responsibility, and it's up to Malta to do that vis-à-vis its own Prime Minister, and he's offered to resign. But over and above that, we need to make certain that the rule of law, the mechanisms of the rule of law, fundamental rights and democracy, are complied with by all member states when it comes to the battle of corruption. Let's remove the nexus between political power and Malta and money in Malta and everywhere else. The Prime Minister is going to resign. He's offered to resign. He's been absolutely clear. And all I can say is that in this case, the political responsibility has been dealt with and made clear at the highest level. No matter what happens, it can't go any higher than the Prime Minister's office. That's what's happened in this case. But the fight needs to go further. It's a question of the rule of law in Malta, and it should be respected there and elsewhere in Europe too. Thank you. Thanks very much, says the President. There are other requests for blue cards, but as we normally do, and for time constraints, we're only going to have one blue card possible per speech. And our next speaker is Ramona Strugariu, who has 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. 2 years have passed since Daphne died. It has been too long, and it has been too much. And when this happened, 751 letters should have left this House to go to the Prime Minister's office in Malta with one single question. Who ordered Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder, and why? And none of those ministers at the European Council should have shaken Muscat's stained hands. Every single hour which passes with Muscat still in office after everything that has happened means defiance to the Maltese people and lack of respect towards the European values. And every single day which passes without us having European legislation to protect investigative journalists and to properly finance their projects and to protect them means a lost day. If we have a mission in this House, then this mission is to defend the rule of law, to defend justice, and to stand up for those who actually fight for justice and finding the truth. Poplu Malti, aħna ma'kom, ġustizzja Daphne.
Maltese people, we are with you. There must be justice for Daphne.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Tineke Strik. 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. The assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia was a brutal attack on the freedom of media and the rule of law that she herself seeks to protect. The fact that political figures seemingly enjoyed impunity in this case for a long time shows how dysfunctional the system of criminal justice and the rule of law in Malta has become. The murder and the lack of follow-up therefore expose the deep crisis of the rule of law in a broader sense, and thus a serious problem with Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. Yet, over the past few years, the European Commission and the European Council refused to take any measures towards the Maltese government, and even now the Council remains silent. Let us be very clear. The case of Daphne is not just a concern for national authorities. If all persons responsible for this crime will not be brought to justice, and if the complicity at the highest level and the systematic corruption is not fundamentally solved, our shared system of fundamental values is failing. So it's high time for the EU to speak up and send a clear message to all journalists in Europe. We will protect the much needed checks and balances within each society, including the work of journalists and the freedom of media. We will make sure that this murder will not silence actors who want and who need to speak up. So my question to the Commission is, what will be the concrete steps of the new Commission towards the Maltese government to ensure a due and independent process in this case? And will it make sure that if Malta fails to correct its rule of law weaknesses and reform its judicial and institutional system, it will intervene? And isn't it time that Member States become more vocal in addressing rule of law violations, not only in political dialogues, but also by using the legal means they have at their disposal, such as state actions brought before the Court of Justice? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Isabella Tovaglieri, who has 3 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The terrible murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist, has revealed the illegal and corrupt system that exists in the institutions of an EU member state. a country which is not being run by a conservative government, which often would be accused of this kind of thing, but rather a socialist government. And now we're hearing about resignations. We assume that this is because he wants the party to be able to take power again. Finally now it seems we are getting this resignation, but not because this is what his conscience demanded, but instead because it's what the people have demanded, and because there have been journalistic investigations which have showed what work has been done by this colleague. The Maltese people are taking to the streets, and for the first time in their history, they're not doing this on partisan basis. Instead, they're just asking for the Prime Minister to immediately leave his position before the 18th of January, as he has announced. They're asking for a change in politics and for the institutions to be drastically changed. And so we should be by their side. For all too long, the European Union has not spoken out about this. We've not spoken against a country which has violated the fundamental principles of Western society: freedom, democracy and respect for rule of law. A few weeks ago, a Parliament delegation from this House went to Malta, and we highlighted major problems for the rule of law in the country, not only talking about limits on freedom of press, a fundamental basis of our societies, but also spoke about a risk to the independence of the justice system and international law. It is no surprise that today, just by one click on your computer, you can find various Maltese companies with their fingers in a great many pies. There are a lot of offshore Maltese companies. Of course, they're not all illegitimate, but many of them are being used to get around tax rules. Europe has guaranteed a free flow of capital between the member states, but we have to ensure that we also have a free flow of information between the police forces, particularly when it comes to financial affairs. A lot of the crimes that were highlighted by Daphne did have a European side of things and involved many member states. This situation is not something which we can tolerate any longer in Europe. The European Parliament and European Commission are now looking at introducing a rule of law mechanism. It is absolutely vital that the Commission intervenes here with the measures that we need and the sanctions required. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Daphne Melbarda, who has 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I hope that murderers of Daphne receive the punishment they deserve, and I hope that Malta will ensure an independent investigation and legal prosecution to bring to justice perpetrators of crimes. Assassination of the Maltese journalist demonstrates that we need to improve legal framework and to provide support to the media so that journalists in Europe can do their work safely and independently. We expect proposals from the European Commission not only to prevent money laundering and corruption, but also to prevent strategic litigation against journalists. We must also provide legal support to journalists who, because of their professional activities, become subject to physical attacks, unjustified litigation, investigations, defamation campaigns and online harassment. And in this respect, Malta is not the only country. Physical safety of journalists in Europe must be indisputable, but it is just as important to provide social security for journalists, and therefore we have to improve support that we give to high-quality journalism. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Miguel Urban Crespo, who has 1.5 minutes. Thanks very much, Mr. President. The case of Daphne Caruana is the face of something which has a lot of facets. It's not just a state-sponsored murder, but it's uncovered her death, tax avoidance and evasion by large companies. She was one of the people behind the Panama Papers, which involved not just the government of Malta, but multimillionaires from all over Europe. What she revealed wasn't a Maltese problem, but a abuse of corporate power with the connivance of public authorities. It goes beyond the borders of Malta, and it means that we should try to throw light on this throughout the European Union. What she revealed in the Panama Papers, nor her murder, have been really followed up and solved. This Parliament can't just look at the case of Daphne, or even just the case of Malta. We need to look also at what Daphne Caruana was revealing in her investigations. Justice for Daphne and for her family can be done also by giving justice to a country that's in hock to the large capital interest. We need to make sure that whistleblowers are protected so we don't have another Daphne Caruana case. There's a large number of Daphne Caruanas in Europe. It's vital that we protect them. It's vital that we don't see another murder like this. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Muito obrigado.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Vladimir Bilčík, who has 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, this Parliament took political leadership last year to protect the journalists after the murders of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírova in Slovakia. This was an extremely important step. And let me tell you, justice in Slovakia hasn't yet been done. And this is why it's so important that everybody in this House exerts pressure for political change in Malta. Because only with that political change we can create space, real space, for justice to be done. That's why it is essential, and that's why we are here today to be the leader of that political change. But our voice is not enough. We need the Member States and we need the Commission to support the people of Malta who deserve to know the truth. And that was going to take time, but the first step is the political change. Prime Minister Muscat has said he would resign. Well, he should go now. He should resign now. This is the key message, and this is a message we are sending from this Parliament right here and right now. In addition to that, of course, we do need major changes in the way we discuss the rule of law in this House and in the European Union. We need a comprehensive mechanism that prevents events such as the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and we need to work on it right now. We need to protect the journalists, and we need preventive measures. We can't discuss crisis management after the murders happen, and that's why we need the answers from the Commission, but also from the Member States right now. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Adjus Saliba, who has 1.5 minutes, please.
President, I am proud to be Maltese. I am proud of my country and will never accept that because of the alleged criminal actions of a few, the whole of Malta be branded a mafia state. From the get-go, the government saw to it that our authorities and institutions were equipped with all the necessary resources to do their work in order to solve this murder, and this has reaped results. The police, together with Europol and the FBI, have carried out intensive investigations, and today we have the alleged killer and murder mastermind, and they are facing justice. The serious and proper manner which the police have carried out their work, with which it has carried out its work, was also confirmed by the EP delegation's visit 2 weeks ago. Moreover, the courts are being allowed to do their job with absolute liberty on the basis of the principle of separation of powers and rule of law. This is a clear signal that our institutions are functioning well and are not prejudiced towards individuals in order to bring justice to bear and resolve this case. Therefore, I believe that the resolution we have before us today is a very unjust one. when compared to the current situation in our country. We recognize that no system is perfect and no country is perfect. And because I am Maltese and because I love my country, I firmly believe and understand that there is room for improvement. However, the government has and is still doing a lot in order to implement a number of recommendations by the Venice Commission and also the European Council. In fact, last week, one of the main recommendations on the powers granted to the General Attorney was fully implemented. We must protect justice by strengthening our institutions and allowing them to work freely. That is what we have always done, and that is what we will always do. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Agios, there's a blue card. Mr. Christoforou has a question for you. Do you accept the card? 30 seconds, Mr. Christoforou. Thank you, President. We in the EPP, given that we are Europeans, we want a powerful European Union to protect the rule of law, independent of the political colour of the government concerned. We're proud as Europeans, and we should be proud of our member states. At the moment, Malta is something which is suffering, and it's important that the proud Maltese people are suffering. How can you feel proud when the head of the Prime Minister's office is now helping the police and looks as if he's involved in this? And just as the Prime Minister still is staying in office, he has not taken responsibility and has not allowed the investigation of this terrible crime to proceed smoothly. Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. Adrius Saliba.
I am proud of my country, within my country and outside of it too, colleague. And I'm surprised that the EPP has used so much energy in this debate. In other debates where we've discussed rule of law in Hungary, for example, you have not shown the same keenness and eagerness. You seem to be very concerned about Malta, less so about others. I am very happy, very proud of the fact that our institutions are not being prejudiced towards anyone and that they're working as they should be, because at the end of the day, every Maltese person wants to see this shocking case be resolved and that justice is brought to bear. And that is what is being done in our country currently, and that is why I'm proud of my country, yes.
Thanks very much indeed. There were other requests for a blue card, but as I said earlier, you can only have one blue card per speech. So we move on to the next speaker on the list, and that's Anna Julia Donat, who has 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Daphne Caruana Galizia had to die because she wanted to reveal the corruption in Malta and the extent that this spread right through the current government. With her death, however, she has been able to set in train a process which finally is reaching up to these highest levels and putting him in the harsh light of day. We've seen that the highest levels are involved and the middlemen have been employed to kill her, and the authorities in Malta have failed completely across the board. I welcome the fact that the Commissioner has written a letter to the Maltese government, but I would call on the Commission to make sure that this process be followed up and that at every stage of the process they fight for the rights of European citizens. As a Hungarian citizen, I'm also in favour of this mechanism of rule of law applied to all member states of the EU, because wherever human rights are abused, they are common values that we all hold dear. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Alice Kunke. 1.5 minutes, please.
Tack.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Defending journalists' possibility to scrutinise us as politicians and other people in public office should be part of our DNA. And this is all the more reason why it is shameful that Malta's government has been insufficient in its actions subsequent to the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. And it's even more shameful that politicians and political groups in this chamber who claim to be Democrats are horse trading on their will to actually bring people to justice. The fact that you have lost your moral compass in the hunt for benefit is shameful in itself, not only because Malta is a member state, but also because every individual politician in every individual assembly who undermines the rule of law is also undermining democracy and the trust that it should exist between we as politicians and the populace, which is the democratic core of our values.
Thanks very much. Next speaker is Mr. Bardella, who has 1.5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. More than 2 years ago now, the whistleblower and journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered. The fact that there were strong links between power and the and business leaders shows the level of the corruption. We have to ensure that these things are sanctioned by the Commission when they are recognised. Panama Papers, tax evasion, money laundering, golden visas. These are things which aren't a problem for Malta alone and should be treated very seriously indeed. You're focusing on so-called populist governments which have been democratically elected, but closing your eyes to the mafia activities going on elsewhere. This case should show that you need to be more prudent in this regard. You need to pay more attention to corruption and to mafia activities in member states. We also have to ensure better protection for whistleblowers. Snowden and Assange themselves have noticed that certain governments and European institutions are not paying attention to this. We have to ensure the sovereignty of the nations. The Maltese people have been taking to the streets to call democratically for an end to this kind of practice. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Peter Lundgren for 1 minute, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor, President. The case of a journalist in Malta, Daphne Caruana Galizia, which occurred back in 2017, is a political stramash that reaches its fingers all the way up to the top levels of the Maltese government. In fact, there are links with the Prime Minister himself. Unfortunately, the EU is a paper tiger without any claws or powers, but at least we as members can express our solidarity and demand justice for Ms. Galizia and her family, and indeed for democracy. I come from a country which has a bunch of journalists who are very clearly left-wing, but we should never accept that journalists be murdered when they're doing their work, which is investigative journalism. And that's why I say to Malta, and especially to the Prime Minister, Mr. Muscat, accept your responsibility and let Ms. Galizia and her family have justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ms. Pelletier for 1 minute, please. Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by congratulating our colleagues on the extreme right who are such keen protectors of freedom of the press. Daphne Caruana Galizia has said things which we have all agreed with. The attack of on an independent press and fundamental rights. Let's think about her family for a moment. The responsibility for this is incumbent on all of us, colleagues. Our collective shrugging of our shoulders in the light of corruption has helped kill Daphne. Do more journalists need to die before we talk about this here? Who remembers that an advisor of Edouard Philippe, a Prime Minister, another Maltese, resigned to protect his boss and is a candidate in European elections? Who remembers that a so-called socialist party, member of the S&D group, and with members sitting in this House, how long is it going to be before we carry out the measures that we need to deal with the corruption that undermines freedom of the press and the lives of whistleblowers? How much time should we allow for more journalists to die before we throw light on the weaknesses of our governments? Thank you. Thanks very much. Our next speaker is David Casa for 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to start with an apology. I apologize for the actions of the Maltese government. Honestly, I never thought I would feel as ashamed of the Maltese government as I feel today. I'm ashamed of the criminal gang that has taken over the Maltese government. I'm ashamed that the institutions in my country didn't do their job. I'm ashamed that they killed Daphne Caruana Galizia. However, the Maltese government is not Malta. These few criminals do not represent the Maltese and Gozitan population. The real Maltese and the Gozitans are in the streets protesting. The Maltese population is resilient, strong, courageous. This is the real Malta. And while the Maltese government makes me feel ashamed, the Maltese people make me proud. Proud that we do not allow anyone to bully us. Proud that today we recognize the fact that amongst the best ever journalists on the continent, there is Daphne. Daphne is the true Maltese. However, now we need to take action on an EU level. Enough with the empty words, vague statements and promises of monitoring. Now is the time to take action. Action must be taken by the Council, which is absent today, and the Commission in order to do their duty. Get a move on and protect the Maltese and Gozitan citizens. Make sure our institutions are on the side of the citizens. The Maltese and Gozitan citizens have a right to all of this. I'm proud to be on the side of the citizens, together with Roberta. I'm proud to be part of the family, of this family here, which has always been the shield of the Maltese and Gozitan citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ms. Inshir for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Democracy, the rule of law and fundamental rights are principles which should never be compromised on. At a time where we're seeing all the more countries diverge from our common values, our reaction has to be to exert greater pressure on member states to immediately change course and respect them once again. Nothing other would be acceptable. We have to have a situation where countries cannot act like this without consequences. Murder, violence and threats are a despicable way of silencing those who think differently and prevent scrutiny, and that doesn't have a place here in Europe or anywhere else in the world. The investigation into the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia is therefore of highest importance and has to be allowed to continue in a completely independent way until the murders and everybody else responsible have been unmasked and been brought to justice. This is a question of fundamental rights, fundamental human rights and the principle of the rule of law. The assistance that's been provided by Europol and the Dutch police authorities has been extremely important to reach the advances that have already been made and has to be allowed to continue. In order to restore the general public's trust, there have to be fundamental changes in Malta. My view, my political group's view, is crystal clear. Fundamental rights and the principle of the rule of law have to be applied to all member states throughout Europe. Malta has received criticism from the Council of Europe's Venice Commission earlier, which is an advisory body comprising independent experts in constitutional and international law. In December 2018, an opinion was adopted which exposed shortcomings and gave recommendations for improvements. I expect that whoever takes over as Prime Minister in that country soon will continue the implementation of the reforms which are necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes now, Madam Keller.
Madame la Présidente.
President, Commissioner Reynders, Commissioner Jourova. The murder of the investigative journalist and blogger Daphne Caruana Galizia on the 16th of November 2017 in Valletta, close to her home, was something which shocked Europe. And the citizens of Malta have now risen up to protest against this odious act. And they are still in the streets in their thousands calling for justice. 2 years later, with the support of Europol, the investigation has brought revelations. Last month, it spoke about the highest sphere of politics in Malta, and the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, was also deemed to be involved or complicit in the murder of Ms. Galizia. Malta is an EU country, and these infringements affect the integrity of the EU as a whole, as my colleagues Anna Donata Tosto and Sophie in 't Veld have said. So I have questions. The European Parliament is going to be following the investigation into Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder. We can see today that no one from the Council has come, so I would like to ask you whether you're going to ask the Council to be involved in this debate. My second question, the Venice Commission from the Council of Europe has already brought out recommendations speaking about fundamental changes that are necessary in the institutions in relation to the fight against corruption and press freedom. We need to ensure that the work done by the Venice Commission is carried out with Malta to bring about these changes. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor for 1.5 minutes to Professor Molly Scott-Cato.
Thank you very much, President. Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered for doing her job as a journalist. She was killed for exposing gross corruption in Malta. And I would like to start by paying tribute to the dignified way in which Daphne's family have continued their campaign for justice. We should honour them by rooting out corruption and ensuring that we act as EU member states to uphold European values. The findings of the Parliament's mission to Malta raise concerns about the progress of Daphne's murder investigation, and our MEPs also found that other investigations into possible money laundering and corruption had either not started or are not being conducted vigorously enough. There are questions to be answered over the independence of the Maltese judiciary and allegations of corruption that extend to the highest levels of government. We cannot allow an EU member state to operate like a mafia state. I've worked a lot on Latin America and witnessed the way that the corrupting influence of dirty money can undermine the rule of law and lead to impunity from justice. And we've also failed in this Parliament to deal with money laundering and tax evasion adequately, and that's something we really need to take seriously because it can corrupt a democracy, undermine people's confidence in democracy, and ultimately undermine European institutions themselves. Daphne Caruana Galizia stood for the highest and finest European values. To honour her memory, we must take all necessary action to uphold the rule of law in Malta. Thank you.
Thank you. And now for 1 minute, Madam Tomacic.
Thank you, Madam President. The fight against corruption and organized crime is much more than paying lip service to transparency and better legal regulation, which we often see in the European Parliament. As an MP in Croatia, I launched the fight against the drugs mafia on my island and then had to face all the dangers that arise for yourself and your family when you stick your neck out. Many people have sacrificed their lives and health for public good. We are indebted to them forever and have to do our utmost to fight crime so that their sacrifice may not be wasted. Daphne Caruana Galizia put the public interest of Malta before her own. She then paid the highest price there is, and it would be a disgrace if the circumstances of her assassination were not clarified. I call on the Maltese government and the European institutions to do everything to solve the case as soon as possible and bring the perpetrators to justice.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Berena Arda.
Thanks, Chair. According to the Council of Europe Platform for the Protection of Journalism and Safety of Journalists, more than half of the cases of abuses against media professionals are committed by state actors. Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated on 16 October 2017, and 2 years later, every aspect of the case is susceptible to political interference from the office of the Prime Minister. The Union must use all tools at its disposal to guarantee media freedom and the protection of journalists in its member states. We need investigative journalism to learn about structural rule of law issues like the high-level corruption cases that Daphne was reporting. If the Union does not give due consideration to the calls of the Maltese citizens, the lack of public confidence will be transferred to the EU itself. And those tools and procedures at the disposal of the Commission to ensure full compliance with Union law must be deployed not only in Malta, but also in the member states to respect human rights in the case of refugees who die in the Mediterranean Sea, as well as the fundamental rights to political participation and the exercise of the right to decide of the peoples of Europe. Thanks.
We have a blue card request, sir. Will you accept a blue card? Mr. Barene, are you... Hello? There is a blue card request. Would you accept? And the card comes from Mr. Zarzele Josh. 30 seconds, please.
Un miembro de su grupo acaba...
A member of your group has just said there's lots of Daphne Caruanas in Europe. I've got the list of murders by ETA of journalists and media professionals, including 4 people killed at one time. You haven't never condemned any of that. And it's not simply you didn't condemn them, you actually justified them and you supported them. Now you have a chance to say today, before speaking about the freedom of expression, let us ask you if you condemn all the crimes of ETA, including those that were, of course, carried out against members of the journalistic profession. Thank you.
Mr.
Zarzalejos, the death of any citizen, not just of the European Union, but of the world, particularly members of the media, is something which is completely unjustifiable and will always be pitied by myself and I assume all my colleagues in this House. Let me say to you that your comment is completely irrelevant. You were part of strategies which shut down the media and acted directly against the freedom of expression and from the Spanish government. And I cannot...
For both the question and the answer under a blue card. We will move on with the debate now, and for 1.5 minutes I give the floor to Mr. Halicki.
Dziękuję, pani przewodnicząca.
Thank you, Madam President. When I read the document from Malta, I'm shocked. Mr. Wilczek said that there was a problem in Croatia as well, but I have different memories. I come from Poland and I remember the journalists killed, the social activists killed, or priests killed by the unknown perpetrators. people in power who commit political crimes, those cannot be accepted among democratic governments, cannot be accepted here in this chamber, not for one day. They have to go immediately. And any power who think they are beyond control cannot be accepted in our democratic community. The resolution that we'll adopt today, I hope, will open a new chapter, so free elections, public support, and then reforms for the judiciary. In this chamber, I hope, without any political calculations, we have to vote together with the Maltese people, show full solidarity. We owe that to the Maltese society because freedom and democracy must be guaranteed in this chamber by such resolution as this that we're going to vote tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Chuhudaru.
Thank you very much. The rules have to be the same for all, especially when we talk about justice, about rule of law and lives of people. I am astonished and worried that nothing has happened yet 2 years after this tragic death. So I believe we need the same rules when we speak about rule of law, states and people. Rules must be observed. When we talk about the cooperation and verification mechanism, about what is happening in various European states, the same mechanism should apply to all states, and those that are subject to evaluation should benefit from the benefit of the doubt to an equal extent. I would like to note the important steps taken in Malta to solve this case and the fact that they are open to European cooperation. So let's have the same rules for everybody, and that each member state and each European citizen should be treated equally.
1.5 minutes now for Mr. Hook.
Thank you, Madam. Daphne Caruana Galizia had a family and friends who mourn her and who must feel a pain that no one should ever have to experience. Some may say that this murder, in which it's alleged there was state collusion, is a matter for Malta only. They are wrong. The rule of law is vital for the freedom of every person. A threat to freedom in one place is a threat to freedom in every place. No country is immune to corruption, whether financial, violent or interference in criminal investigations. Daphne Caruana Galizia was investigating money laundering, tax evasion and other evils. Her murder was barbaric and futile because others will surely take up the challenge of exposing wrongdoing, and there should be EU law to protect journalism. It is clear that the mission from the European Parliament has taken the quest for truth forward. This should not be the last time the Parliament takes such action. The EU is a set of promises, including a promise to the people of Europe that the rule of law will be upheld. It does not matter which member state. It does not matter which political family politicians may come from. The only things that matter are truth and impartial justice.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Mr. Freund.
Thank you, Madam President. Je länger die Untersuchungen
The longer the investigation in Malta goes on, the greater the extent of the crisis of the rule of law in Malta becomes clear. Tax evasion, corruption, right up until the Prime Minister's office. I spoke with the son of Daphne in Brussels last week, who very clearly and impressively exposed the situation. There's a small corrupt elite that has taken over power in Malta, and the EU must not stand by and accept this sort of situation, because there is no democracy, there is no freedom of the press in the European Union if investigations into corruption end in death. Those who are corrupt exploit the freedom of moving money around and the mechanisms of the rule of law to their own ends. We have to make sure that justice and police work better together than those corrupt people do. We must coordinate better to make sure that crime is fought at European level, and that we make sure that the toolbox is available to fight this effectively. We have to have a rule of law mechanism for the EU urgently.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Leonars.
Thank you, Chair. 26 months ago, the voice of Daphne Caruana Galizia was silenced. A brave and fearless voice dedicated to fight corruption and to stand up for human rights, for our rights. And her assassination is a blow to us all. It strikes at the heart of our society. And therefore, we must fight for justice. Fight for justice for Daphne, the murderers, but everybody else involved, the middlemen, the masterminds, those providing political cover, must be identified and prosecuted. Impunity must end in Malta. But how can we expect justice when there is no rule of law? How can we trust in an independent investigation as long as the Prime Minister continues to cling to power? Can we really expect the same people that have been obstructing justice for the past 26 months, the same people that have been demolishing the memorials that were erected in honour of Daphne's memory, can we really expect these people now suddenly to lead the charge in seeking justice that the family of Daphne so deserves? How naive are we exactly supposed to be? The Venice Commission already concluded over a year ago that the wide powers of the Prime Minister create a serious risk for the rule of law. And we see that risk now in Malta, day after day after day, and every minute longer this Prime Minister stays in the centre of power is a minute where justice can escape for us. Therefore, dear colleagues, let me finish with the only word in Maltese that I know. Prime Minister Muscat, bara.
And now for 1.5 minutes, Madam Kutaya.
I am Maltese and I appreciate the revelations of the last weeks. I am shocked as the rest of the country. We Maltese want justice. However, it wouldn't be just if the bad actions of certain individuals would affect all the Maltese government. We should strengthen the European values. We shouldn't take a position according to the sides. We should remember that we are in this stage because, as the Libe delegation confirmed, the Maltese police worked together with Europol. Malta stopped and decided, we started a process to reform the institutions. We won't stop before the whole constitutional reform is concluded. Like this, we strengthen the democracy in Malta. In these times of changes, an action on Malta wouldn't be beneficial, and it wouldn't be just with the Maltese and Godzitans.
Now, Madam Voutmans.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In French. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, in Dutch. This is a debate we have to have. Daphne Caruana Galizia, who is a blogger, an investigative journalist, a mother of 3, was cowardly murdered because she was just doing her job. In fact, because she did her job too well. And moreover, there does seem to be the impression here that the corruption, the organised crime, is interleaved with the highest political offices in Malta. And Malta is part of Europe. What affects Malta affects Europe. And I think you'll all agree with me that Europe has a right to politicians who show integrity, with journalists who can operate independently without being interfered with, without being threatened with murder. And we need an independent judiciary. So I ask you urgently, please react quickly, react strongly, and enter a dialogue with Malta rather today than tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes for Madam Vosenberg-Vironidi.
Thanks very much, Madam President. After the arrest of a close aide to Prime Minister Muscat, and now the attempt to find out who was behind the murder of Daphne Caruana, the people are waiting for the government and Prime Minister to resign. People are extremely concerned about the developments, and we and European leaders need to take a position. As the rejection of the government mounts in society, the Prime Minister refuses to go. Why won't he resign? Is he afraid of what the legal system will discover if they carry on their investigations? We are aware now of the crimes and the murders of journalists and the rise of the mafia. It's all linked together, and the refusal of Mr. Muscat to leave, which looks like an attempt to stop the institutions from working smoothly, is a vitally important issue that affects all of us. All member states now need to, more than ever, do something about this, because in Malta the situation is getting worse and worse, and it's something which affects the rule of law which underpins the whole of the European Union. They need to listen to the people of Malta and their desire to see legality return to the country. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Madam Yoncheva.
Thank you, Chair. As a former investigative journalist, I cannot explain how much this discussion means to me and won't try to hide my emotions. What happened in Malta is a huge tragedy, and we need to ensure that justice will be served and Daphne Galizia won't be forgotten. But at the same time, we need to realize that many journalists in Europe are threatened, intimidated by people with power. In Bulgaria, for example, the index of media freedom is the lowest in the EU. Media pluralism is almost absent. Corruption at all levels is spreading. I think it's time to stop playing political games and to start acting. We cannot pretend that what happened in Malta is an isolated national problem. There are similar symptoms in many member states. We need to go much further than just condemning the situation in a resolution. We need European mechanisms that will allow us to identify the shortcomings in the system before we witness the next tragedy. And I urge the Commission not to hide behind soft measures. We need comprehensive solutions and concrete proposals. And we need them now. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1 minute, Madam Vaughan.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Just a minute.
Don't worry. We're calm. It's before Christmas. Everyone is in a good mood, even though this is a really serious debate. So we will await your contribution.
Sorry.
Ready to go?
Yes.
Good.
Thank you. Firstly, might I congratulate our parliamentary delegation to Malta for ensuring that the corruption, scheming and impunity in that country is held under a spotlight. These things that undermine our democracies and the legitimacy of our political systems flourish in darkness. All involved have done well to shine a light on Malta. Parliament has done well to force the Council and the Commission to take note, but we must ensure that the Council and the Commission take firm action to guarantee the integrity of Malta and of all our democracies. As a former journalist myself, when I look at the situation for independent journalism across member states, I shiver. Daphne Caruana Galizia is murdered, the Maltese government has questions to answer, and the S&D conveniently forget their voices. The EPP ignores and tacitly complies in the silencing of the Hungarian press. And earlier this year in my own country, Lyra McKee, a young LGBT journalist, was murdered in Northern Ireland. These are just a few examples of the situation across the continent. Colleagues, I urge all of you to apply the utmost passion in holding the Maltese government to account, but do not stop there. Ensure that no journalist, no political or civil society activist dies in vain. I urge all of you to forget political convenience, forget the difficulties of taking action against a member state, and deliver strong, efficient legislation that delivers for all European citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Madam Edstadler.
Mord verjährt nicht.
Murder is a crime, and any murder is one murder too many. And murder doesn't only leave behind it mourning, it also leaves behind it a wish for investigation. And there are murders that have a broader importance as well. The murder of this Maltese investigative journalist is an attack against press freedom, an attack against our values here in Europe. This was the life of a woman that was ended because she was trying to fight against corruption and for the rule of law. She has been silenced forever. With the involvement of people who were very close to the Prime Minister. We have to ask ourselves why the Prime Minister won't step down now. The S&D now is talking here in the plenary of the European Parliament. They should not be supporting him, they should be speaking very clearly. We need to investigate this murder and clarify the facts. The S&D group and Joseph Muscat as Prime Minister, he should not remain in that position for 30 days more, for any days more. This is not something which should happen in the EU. What would we be saying if this was happening in a country outside the EU? Particularly, what would we hear from the S&D? So I would call on Prime Minister Muscat to immediately step down to ensure that the changes that are necessary for the rule of law in Malta can take place straight away. Thank you.
Thank you. For 2.5 minutes, Madam Barley.
Today, Reporters Without Borders have released their 2019 annual report. This year, 49 journalists have been killed while exercising their job. 57 media people have been abducted, 389 have been interfered with, and many of these people have paid with their lives, if not their freedom, because they've trampled on the toes of the mighty and because they've threatened power. This was the case with Daphne Caruana Galizia as well. The murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia was commemorated for the second occasion in October. She fought for truth and paid with her life. Our solidarity has to be with her and her family. We are obligated to act. Her fight for transparency and against corruption must not be in vain. We must do everything for her memory. And there are three ways of approaching this. First of all, we are going to contribute to make sure that those who are guilty or complicit in their murder be brought to justice. Truth must out. Secondly, we have to make sure that journalists can do their work without being put in danger. A free press that also scrutinizes those in power, that can be a threat to those in power, is essential for our society and a functioning state under the rule of law in the EU, in member states of the EU and around the world. And also we have to attack this evil at its root. We have to attack the reason why Daphne Caruana Galizia was involved as an investigative journalist. We cannot look away when rights under the rule of law are abused or violated. We must stand up, we must act to fight corruption, to fight money laundering, to make sure that the independence of the judiciary is assured and independent prosecution is assured. We have to make sure that the granting of so-called golden visas and passports that happens in 17 member states of the EU, that this is looked at in detail and we prevent this from happening. We should make sure that a free and strong civil society is ensured and can raise its voice when problems are discovered, and we also have to make sure that there's an early stage mechanism to deal with issues such as the one we've seen in Malta, dealt with at an earlier stage. We need a mechanism for the rule of law democracy, and this is something we owe to Daphne Caruana Galizia.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Maxova.
Vážená paní předsedající, děkuji za slovo.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, journalists through their work defend freedom and democracy, and this is something that we should support. Transparent action and transparency is something which should be a given. And investigative journalists should not be losing their lives in this way. That is what has happened in the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia. 2 years ago, this woman lost her life, and her family, friends and colleagues still don't know exactly what happened. It's important for us to discuss this topic. And we should not stay silent when journalists lose their lives in this way. Now, yes, it's not yet clear exactly what happened, but we need to send out a very clear signal that anybody who is murdered in this way will have an investigation, and we have to ensure that the system works and show that it works. I come from the Czech Republic, and in our neighbouring country, Slovakia, a journalist was murdered, Mr. Kuciak. And I think we should be speaking about him as well, because both of these cases are quite similar. Both of these cases need to be investigated in great detail, not just so that the family and friends of the victims can find peace, but so that we can send out a clear signal that we all need the opportunity to speak the truth. Thank you.
Rangel for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. First, I'd like to say that today, during this debate, we pay tribute to Daphne Caruana Galizia, because she is a martyr of freedom in the European Union. Then I must say that I'm ashamed, because the Commission, European Commission, is too shy. European Council is too silent. And some colleagues, especially from S&D, they have not courage to say what they would say if there was a journalist in Russia that is murdered, if there is a journalist in Turkey that is murdered, if there is a journalist that is persecuted in China. S&D would have here a debate with all the courageous. And then, when we are in the European Union, in our smallest country, you don't have the courage to say that this is a shame, this is against rule of law. And if Mr. Muscat is so democratic and so attached to rule of law, why doesn't he resign? He could do a service to democracy, to transparency, to a clean and serious investigation. But he doesn't do it. He would serve the European Union, not only the Maltese people, if he resigned immediately. And that is the claim that I hope that S&D can do now. If you have courage, please say Joseph Muscat resign and save the honour of the Maltese people and the honour of the European Union.
Mr. Sant for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. That Malta faces serious problems of governance is clear. They arose in the context of the horrendous murder of journalist Mrs. Caruana Galizia and also beyond. The murder has been duly investigated in past years and is close to being resolved. There have been fatal failures of judgment even at the top level. The political price for them is being paid. The situation in Malta now is one of transition, both at the political level and that of the criminal investigation. What is needed is a dispassionate review of the situation leading to reforms that will ensure no future repetition of past mistakes. True, the criminal investigation arrived at sensational findings. Even more sensational allegations have been made on the basis. We have heard them being repeated during this debate, mostly for political jockeying. This runs contrary to the interest of the Maltese people, whose commitment to European values is secure. When considering how European values are being respected, we must follow objective criteria applied to all by an institution that all can trust. The resolution on which we shall vote tomorrow combines findings, allegations, one-sided interpretations in a statement that paints black everything Maltese. It also blacks out the economic, social and cultural progress achieved in Malta during past years, which is not fair. Soon in Malta there will be a new Prime Minister heading a new government. They will be committed to a new beginning on governance issues to correct the radical failures of the past, on meting out full justice and punishment to all those responsible for the Caruana Galizia assassination, on ensuring a better separation of powers in governance, on combating corruption, on promoting transparency in government affairs. These objectives will be given total priority. Such commitments will be carried out in all good faith by the new Malta government. That we guarantee. The current transition should be given a chance to develop. Making premature judgments about it is not the right way. There has to be a right way for this Assembly to consider the affairs of Malta, one that would be applied equally to other member states like Hungary or Poland. No matter how well intentioned, the direction in which this debate has been driven is not the right way. Not the right way for Malta, neither is it the right way for Europe. We need a better way. Thank you.
For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Kurner.
Frau Präsident.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. If you murder journalists, you're killing democracy, because without freedom of the press, you have no value of any freedoms. And that's why the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia is so dramatic, because it attacks press freedom and democracy not just in Malta, but the whole of Europe, endangers that freedom. So I'd like to thank our colleagues from the European Parliament, and especially under the leadership of Sophia in 't Veld, for having investigated on the ground. And I'd like to endorse wholeheartedly her recommendations that the Prime Minister must step down so that the investigation be allowed to carry on freely there. Mr Muscat, please resign. And S&D, please join that demand. This line of reasoning is something I cannot in any way comprehend. The previous speaker assured that, well, there's going to be a new government anyway, so why doesn't he resign now and ensure that this investigation be allowed to carry on unhindered? That should be the single clearest demand that they agree to. But ladies and gentlemen, the situation shows once again that we see that the rule of law is being discussed in different areas of the EU. It's not a question of a geographic east-west issue. This is a question for Europe to deal with. We need to defend fundamental rights throughout Europe. We need to defend freedom of the press throughout Europe. We have to make sure the rule of law exists throughout Europe, and we have to protect journalists throughout Europe. That's why this investigation should be allowed to be carried out, and we have to find some answers and get the rule of law back in Malta.
Thank you. For 1.5 minutes, Madam Niebler.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, colleagues. The murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia was a contract murder. There are some very deep-rooted corruption and many people have been complicit in this, and they resorted to murder. 2 ministers have already stood down, and as has been said, the Prime Minister has announced that he will resign. I'm wondering what he's waiting for. Mr Muscat needs to stand down immediately, and with that send out a clear signal that he is no longer going to stand in the way of the criminal proceedings in this case. Only if he stands down can we do away with the suspicion that members of the government themselves are complicit in these corrupt activities and are standing in the way of the investigation. Colleagues, the European Union stands for rule of law, and rule of law is a very valuable thing indeed. There should be no doubt what Europe stands for. Beyond all political boundaries, we need to ensure that we can protect the rule of law, and this is something which should come before all political interests. Therefore, I call on our colleagues on the left and from the S&D to tactically step back here and to make a very clear decision. Ms. Sippel, I haven't heard you say anything about Mr Muscat that suggests that you're of the opinion that immediate action is required. I think that is not a dignified approach, and I think that we need to ensure that he does stand down as soon as possible. Murder is murder. Thank you.
Mr. Polak for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you for the floor. Brutal murders of journalists in Malta and Slovakia revealed how far and high can the corruption and mafia make it in politics, Attorney General's office, courts, and how helpless the EU institutions are. Atrocious murders of Daphne Caruana Galizia and Jan Kuciak and his fiancée show us how weak Europe is. The role of the EU is our common community, is also to put a mirror to itself. That includes those who are part of our community. Problems with corruption exist in many countries. In Malta and Slovakia, the mirror should have been placed to the governments long before the murders of a journalist. This mirror was missing, and due to the negligence of the institutions, innocent people had to die. I call upon all EU institutions to speedily develop press on Malta to guarantee an investigation without any influence of politicians, judges, or attorney generals. This is the reason why anybody, that includes also the Prime Minister who is involved in this murder, have to leave their post. At the same time, this case of Malta and Slovakia is a lesson for all Europe, and nobody has to be weak when they witness mafia practices. In Slovakia and also in Malta, the corruption had gone so far that they were not just stealing money, they also murdered people, and we have to return the justice back to people. The state belongs to people, not to mafia.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes. Mr. Hedvegi.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, first of all, a word of respect for Daphne Caruana Galizia, for her sacrifice and her work. This is a cornerstone of democracy. Obviously, that we stand up for her and what she represented. But what we see here today is really the hypocrisy of the left, and especially of the S&D group. And this is, I think, outrageous. Instead of being clear about it, instead of calling on the Maltese Prime Minister to step down, they are wishy-washy about it. There's a lack of clarity, a lack of clear will to act on their side. This hypocrisy actually undermines anything and the credibility, especially when they talk about the rule of law elsewhere. They are busy now talking about Hungary and Poland. Well, I have to say it's outrageous and ridiculous to even mention in one sentence together what happened in Malta and any political debate that we may have about things in Poland and in Hungary. We have to be very clear about it. We have to stand up clearly for these basic values. Where is the S&D fraction? They even tried to take this agenda item off the plenary session this week. Why? Where is the strength that other times you present about these issues? Where is your readiness to talk about these issues? You need to be standing up for values just without any double standards, the same standard for everybody. So I'm looking for that commitment from the S&D group. Thank you.
There is a blue card request, if you're happy to take that, from Mr. Agios Salibi.
Yeah.
Sir, you have the floor for 30 seconds with your question.
If there's someone who's contradictory, is an MEP from Hungary. You are trying to attack us using the argument of the rule of law. There's a difference between Hungary and Malta. We are implementing the amendments as recommended by the Venice Convention. However, your country is changing the laws in order to undermine the rule of law in your country today. But we are working in the opposite way. We are implementing amendments in order to strengthen the rule of law.
Would you answer the statement, please, in 30 seconds?
Sure, thank you very much. Well, very simple. Just this Prime Minister, Muscat, he needs to go. He needs to go right away. There is a murder let me just repeat, there's a murder of a journalist in Malta, and links go to the Prime Minister's office. I mean, he should just simply resign. You should have new elections and ask the people of Malta to act. In Hungary, we may have a political debate, we may have a debate with the Commission at times, very well. That's what Europe is about, political debate. Doesn't even compare to what's happened in Malta. This is outrageous, and again, the hypocrisy of the left is just outstanding in this matter.
For 1.5 minutes, Mr. Siekatz.
Ja, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, we see on the 8th of December the headline in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung that there's murder going up to the highest level of the politicians in Malta. Now we need to defend the freedom of journalism. They are looking at the highest levels of politicians everywhere, and we should respect the fact that Mr. Bullman, who said that journalism should be free to investigate politicians of any political colour, we should see that actually coming to fruition. We need to make sure that rule of law be put in place. It's not a question of returning to the rule of law in Malta, because we're a long way from that. There has to be a serious investigation first of all. But to allow proper investigation, obviously Mr. Muscat has to resign straight away to make sure that he's not making evidence disappear. There's another thing that's very shocking, and that is the behaviour of the S&D. It is very worrying. We've heard some general wish-wash, but nothing specific at all in this debate, and that is a shame for such a great popular party that the S&D should be. I call on the Socialists and Democrats to distance themselves finally and definitively from their party friend Youssef Muscat.
I now give the floor to Mr. Bellarmé for 1.5 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues.
Madam President, colleagues, a journalist has been murdered, Daphne Caruana Galizia, and we should say, first of all, and I think we all should be unanimous in expressing our support to her family, those close to her, those who are weeping because she died for trying to tell the truth. The EU is not an international organisation like others. We have a heritage. We have the principles, freedom of conscience, the search for truth. And when we talk about the rule of law, ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, we don't have the right to be selectively angry. We don't have the right to show double standards. Colleagues, how dare you preach when you weren't capable of saying what was vital? The Maltese Prime Minister needs to resign now, because in this period it's possible that he's destroying evidence and obstructing an inquiry. We should all feel affected by what's happening here. It's the future of freedom, the freedom of the press. The Commission and Council have a role to play to make sure that the rule of law is guaranteed. Each of our colleagues needs to speak clearly on this matter. And let me ask colleagues in the Renew group something. Among the future French MEPs who will sit after Brexit, there's someone who's worked for Mr. Muscat and had to resign from his post in France when he was working for the French Prime Minister. Can Mr. Sandragosi really talk about be part of a renaissance for Europe? I'm pretty sure the answer is no. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. We now move to Catch the Eye, and you may have noticed that I was more lax with time because there was some space in our agenda to give colleagues time to finish their speeches. So I now give the floor under the Catch the Eye 1-minute procedure to Mr. Fourlas.
Thank you, Madam President. As an investigative journalist myself for 3 years, it deeply wounds me that a colleague could be murdered doing her job. It's even worse when I realise that there is the question of state actors being involved in the murder. I'd like to express how concerned I am and how important it is that our Maltese friends find out the truth and that the people behind the murder of my colleague Daphne Galizia is prosecuted. It's important that the guilty parties, no matter how high up they are found and that they pay the price for what they did. We need to work with those who are fighting corruption and trying to shed light on these issues. We're all Maltese today. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Madam Ward.
Corruption, obfuscation, interference, lack of transparency, intimidation. All these things seem to have been in play at the highest level in Malta regarding the murder of the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. But I want to draw attention to the unacceptable behaviour of the management of the state-appointed Valletta 2018 European Capital of Culture, who not only regularly dismantled the public memorialisation of Daphne, but also censored artists invited to the festival. This included a British theatre company who were offered an open-ended residency in the programme and invited to make work responding to their experiences. When it seemed their performance would include references to Daphne, they were asked to change their script. Artistic censorship is totally unacceptable in our European Union, and questions must be asked of the Commission officials regarding monitoring of the use of citizens' money in a culture of state repression. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank PEN International for their work on this issue. Also, the theatre artists Rebecca Biscuit and Louise Mothersole, who are now telling the story of how they were censored by the Maltese authorities, winning an Edinburgh Fringe Festival award in the process.
Thank you. Madam Šojdrová.
Děkuji za udělení slova. Kolegyně a kolegové.
Thank you very much. The murder of journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia is a very important topic. And how long did it take before the investigation got underway? How long will it take before people are brought to justice? It's taken a very long time indeed, and there is a parallel here with what's going on in Slovakia. In Slovakia too, a journalist was murdered. Now, I think if the ministers hadn't stood down, do we imagine that the truth would ever have started to come out, that the investigation would ever have moved forward? I think not. It's clear here that in the European Parliament we need to now call for the resignation of Prime Minister Muscat. It's only in this way that the police is going to be able to investigate. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Heischel for 1 minute.
Ďakujem pekne.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I do believe that we all here agree that it is a bad news for democracy if a journalist is murdered, regardless of the place. I believe that we have something in common. All of us have problems with corruption, some places more, some places less. Sometimes we have difficulties with freedom of speech and media, and so on. But here we need to say that we need to be helpful as EU institutions. We need to help an objective an independent investigation, independent from any political pressure. The Prime Minister of Malta has been asked to resign. As said, the Slovak Prime Minister resigned, but I don't believe this was the most important in the process. The most important thing is to make sure that the investigation and police and justice can be free, independent from political power. This is the most important thing. In Slovakia, we already have reaped the fruit, and several people who ordered the murder of Jan Kuciak, journalist of Slovakia, were already brought to justice. As the institutions, we must be independent, and we must avoid influencing the political forces. And for example, missions of Libe Committee to Malta shouldn't take place just before the elections in Malta. Thank you.
Madam Grappini.
Thank you very much. Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues, the lives of people, whether they are journalists or any other professions, have to be safe in the European Union. I do not believe that there is any colleague in this room that does not condemn the murder of the journalist. I was in Malta with a delegation and I could see with my own eyes the grave of this journalist and the tragedy. But let's think, let's wonder whether we are doing the right thing here, Madam Commissioner. I think we should identify the root causes. Hadn't those situations been revealed, would that journalist have been murdered? Do we have mechanisms to remove corruption and money laundering in order to avoid placing the journalists in critical situations? Because all member states have journalists that are under threat and even killed, as it was the case in Slovakia as well. Madam Commissioner and dear colleagues, I believe that we cannot interfere in the things that the national parliaments should do. The European Parliament does not change the governments. It is the national parliaments doing this. So let's not make the mistake of doing this. But I call on the Commission to identify European mechanisms so as to avoid placing journalists in similar situations such as Daphne's. I send my sincerest condolences to the family. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our Catch the Eye, and I give the floor back to the Commission, Commissioner Reynders. My pronunciation may not be perfect now, but it will improve. Thank you. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. And I want first of all to thank you all for this debate and also for your support for an independent investigation after the murder of the journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. Justice needs to be done. The new Commission is very clear on such a need. In the 2 first weeks in office, the President of the Commission has sent a clear message to the Maltese authorities. We did the same in different phone calls from the Vice President Jourova and myself to the Minister of Justice, Owen Bonici, and I have sent a letter to the Minister of Justice yesterday. More than that, Europol is at the disposal of the Maltese authorities to take part in the investigations, and we have seen some progress in the investigation due to the presence also of Europol, and we will continue to follow the progress in the investigations. We need to do that not only for Daphne Caruana Galizia, for his family, but to defend our values in the European Union. I want to say that the protection of the journalists, because I have heard many questions about that, is first of all, of course, a competence of the Member States, but the Commission must take also some initiatives to support the media pluralism and to support also independent journalists that work in all the Member States. And we'll continue to do that, and maybe we'll enhance our capacities to do that. Then we need to control a correct implementation of justice reforms after the country-specific recommendations adopted by the Council of 9 July 2019. In my letter, I have insisted on the independence of judiciary with safeguards for judicial appointments and dismissals with a real separate prosecutor office. The Commission will present an evaluation on the process reform and propose concrete actions. The Commission has a toolbox to address rule of law concerns, and we are ready to make use of it. I recall that the Commission did introduce infringement proceedings against Malta for non-transposition of the 4th Anti-Money Laundering Directive with success. As the situation evolves, we will consider which instruments are appropriate, including a possible application of the rule of law framework if it's needed. And, of course, about all those reforms, we encourage the Maltese authorities to consult the Venice Commission on all draft legislation. Third, about the investor citizenships scheme. In the supranational risk assessment published in July 2019, the Commission has highlighted that citizenship investment programmes and investor residence schemes, also known as golden passport and golden visas, entail a significant money laundering threat. The January 2019 Commission report on investor citizenship and residence schemes in the European Union highlights that their schemes inherently raise money laundering concerns. Awarding citizenship is a prerogative of the Member States. However, Member States must, when exercising their powers in the sphere of nationality, have due regard to European Union law. European Union citizenship brings together rights to all Member States, providing solidarity. Together, Member States create the conditions for enjoying EU citizenship. This common achievement should not be exploited by individual Member States' risky investor schemes. We evaluate if legislation is needed to fight against the abuse of golden passport and if we must introduce infringement proceedings. To conclude, we need to enhance the culture of the rule of law in all the Member States in the European Union. And if we want to speak about the rule of law outside the European Union, it's needed to deliver, to do the job at home. It's the reason why the Commission will organise and will set up a new mechanism with an annual report on the rule of law in all the Member States without any discrimination. It will be the occasion of a real political debate in the Council and also in the Parliament. We have such a process about the budgetary situation of all the Member States. It's time to have the same political debate about our values, about the values of the European Union. That doesn't mean the abandon of all the other tools at our disposal. We will continue to introduce infringement proceedings, to organise dialogue on the rule of law, to pursue the Article 7 procedures. And so, of course, it's an important moment today in this debate because we follow very closely the investigations about the murder of a journalist. But I want also to thank you for your support because we have a lot of things to do together to protect the rule of law, to defend our values. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Renders. Colleagues, we have one motion for resolution to wind up our debate from 6 political groups. Our debate is now closed and the vote will be held on Wednesday. And can I just say that as we conclude our debate on the murder of journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, let us salute the courage of her family, even though their hearts are broken. We now have a suspension for a few minutes until we vote at 12. Thank you.